Did you folks miss me? I'm so sorry to leave you hanging like that. The holidays are over, it's a new year, and now it's an all new Prove It To Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. So it turns out podcasting is difficult. I mean, maybe if I just wanted to spew utter nonsense about meaningless bullshit, it would be easier. Like, this really is complicated and time consuming. Over the past few weeks, I've developed a much greater appreciation for those true crime podcasts, or even the ones that aren't about crime but require a lot of investigative reporting. Setting up interviews, writing everything down, putting it together in a logical story form timeline to keep the audience engaged, these things are legitimately the culmination of years of work. And what do? We binge it in 6 hours. We love the stories, but we don't always take the time to appreciate all the work that went into it. And I don't even know what these folks get paid, but divided up over the hours spent on content creation and production, it can't be phenomenal. And here I am over in my dark little corner working on a niche podcast that I truly believe is something we need. I am super passionate about research, true research, studies that are methodical in nature, experimental in nature, collecting data to better understand the relationships between phenomena in this crazy complex world. To me, this work is exciting. The challenge is that it takes a lot to make it exciting for the masses. Something you probably noticed in my first couple of Study Finds episodes, the real research is super in-depth, takes a lot of time, and usually only ends up concluding one or two tiny little facts that barely move the needle on our understanding of these relationships between concepts. Then, the good studies will say, quote, "We need more research in this area." That's frustratingly boring. That's why when we read news articles that summarize the abstracts of big research projects, they almost have to embellish a little. Otherwise, no one would read it. Not only that, I've said this before that it's difficult for the layperson to access this research. You have to have academic credentials or paid access to read the research we're talking about. Unless it's open access, in which case the study authors themselves paid for that privilege. So we find ourselves in this weird situation where real, unembellished research, by default, ends up being for the researchers. Not intentionally, but incidentally. We have this disproportionate number of folks who are academics themselves reading the work of other academics and performing more research themselves to be read by, mostly, other academics. It's a never-ending cycle. And I'm not saying any of this discredits the merits of the work. What I'm trying to get across is that as a researcher myself, the intent of my work has always been to apply my research to practice. If I statistically analyze the relationships between two variables and find a significant relationship that we didn't know about before, or if I figure out a way to measure something that's never been measured before, that's not for my benefit. It may benefit another researcher who wants to take it further, but that's not necessarily my primary goal either. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say that most researchers' goals are to improve the way things work in the real world, not the theoretical or hypothetical world. Look, I don't currently manage a workplace safety program, but I do a lot of research intended to improve our understanding of workplace safety. Does it do any good for that research to only circulate among other academic researchers? No! They're not the ones facing serious injuries and fatalities on a daily basis. They're not the ones who need the opportunity to apply new concepts to really move the needle on improving workplace safety. The information provided by this research needs to reach the people who are actively managing workplace safety programs. They are the ones who will be able to make a difference based on research findings. But how do they get that knowledge? How do they get access to that research? How do they get the opportunity to learn new concepts and tools that will help them prevent serious injuries and fatalities and organizational risks? You might say conferences are a good outlet. It's true. I love a good professional development conference. I routinely present my research at a lot of them. However, not everybody gets to go to these. For example, I know the American Society of Safety Professionals had a record breaking 6,000 attendees at their National Professional Development Conference in Denver in 2024. That's great, but that's still only a small fraction of their total membership if you assume that all attendees are members, and an even smaller fraction of the total number of safety professionals working in the United States alone. Another thing about conferences, and I'm not necessarily calling out any specific conference here, I'm only speaking on my collective experience with conferences in general. As an attendee, you can find a lot of good sessions that present solid research with a lot of evidence. Unfortunately, these sessions can get lost among the dilution of sessions that are plagued with topics that are really just these big, sexy ideas, but present absolutely no evidence or actionable takeaways. They might get great reviews because the speaker is engaging, but really, nobody learns shit, and none of it is helping actually improve the profession. Again, I'm not calling anyone out specifically, but if you're like me and you've attended these conferences, you probably know what I'm talking about. I know, as a researcher and a routine speaker, I get frustrated when my evidence based information gets lost in the sauce. With all of this, we can get good research out to the masses at these conferences, but the reach is limited and sometimes diluted. So, what else do we have? You could say webinars. Listen, I have nothing against webinars or virtual conferences, but there are limitations to these too. I mean, is anyone else flooded with requests to attend a webinar, or is that just me? I mean, after I've sat on virtual calls all day, the last thing I want to do is jump on another platform to attend another webinar that may or may not be useful and is probably just going to have frustrating technical issues anyway. I mean, just to be safe, I'm going to log in and get credit for my certificate of attendance, but really, I'm intermittently listening while I answer emails or get other projects done. At one time, I feel like webinars were a cool new medium. And during the pandemic, we probably saw a record attendance for these things. Now I'm very picky about both attending webinars and presenting on webinars. I'm sure a lot of other folks are too. So now what? And I'm not talking right now about writing and publishing research. We're kind of assuming that's just happening. But we already talked about the difficulty in accessing that stuff by the folks who really need to read it. I'm going on this entire tangent to say that there is a real opportunity to use a different medium for dissemination of research. It's podcasting. And yes, even the podcasting world is flooded with content. I mean, if I have a choice of listening to my favorite comedians talk about meaningless stuff or listening to academics talk about research, okay, yeah, I might also prioritize the former rather than the latter in my daily listening habits. But here's the deal: you don't have to have special access to listen to podcasts. You don't have to listen to them in real time. You can access podcasts in the library years after they are published. You can talk for 5 minutes about your research, or you can go on for hours. And if you don't want to be on video, you don't even have to fix your hair. By the way, in case you were wondering, it does take 6 different products, but only 10 minutes to do this hair. Gentlemen, you too can have fantastic hair in only 10 minutes or less. You don't have to remain filled with envy just because Dr. Law has better hair than you. Okay, back to the tangent. This is a call to researchers and consumers of research. Let's get this stuff to a larger audience through podcasting. Let's make the effort to bridge the gap between research and practice by getting evidence based solutions out in an easily accessible way to the people who can make the difference. If you have research to share, or if you recently read a study that you want to talk about, whether to praise it or critique it, send me an email at contact@proveitpod.com. Yes, this whole podcasting thing has proven to be difficult and time consuming for me, but I truly believe this little niche podcast is for the greater good. I want our practitioners to learn about the work that is happening in academia. I want them to be able to learn how we are thinking about different relationships and how to measure concepts. I want them to be able to take these things and apply them to their work, especially when we're talking about workplace safety. I firmly believe that protecting people, property, and the environment will not happen because of all these big ideas and theories and conceptual models that have absolutely no data or evidence to back them up. It will happen because of good research that gets placed into the hands of practicing professionals, from the field to the plant floor to the C suite, and who can make real change happen with actionable evidence in hand. Let's do that. Let's get research out to the people who can make a difference. When we do that, I can cut back on these silly little study finds episodes, bashing news outlets for over embellishing research and making you think that you're about to die because of your sleeping and eating habits. But while I do have some researchers in the pipeline who want to talk to you about some of the great work they're doing, I don't want to deny you your regular dose of research that you've come to know and love in the few short episodes that I've undoubtedly had your undivided attention, right? You're not doing other stuff like driving while listening to this, are you? You better be paying attention to me. I demand attention. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I find for most things that I listen to, I pay attention even better when I'm doing something else, like house chores, exercising, driving. Personally, I'm more likely to get sidetracked and stop paying attention when I'm just sitting and listening. I apologize to every professor in whose lectures I totally spaced out. Spoiler alert, it was every single one of you. Not your fault. As it turns out, my attention span isn't the only thing that suffers when I'm sedentary. It could also be my heart health. Now, listen, I know some of you are looking for safety research. Guess what? I actually did that this time. I went to the National Safety Council's Safety and Health magazine for this one. So take that. Here's the headline: Study asks. Okay, it's not study finds, it's study asks, but close enough, right? Okay, study asks, how much sedentary time is too much? Now, look, I'm actually going to give Safety and Health magazine some credit here. First, this headline draws me in without drawing an overzealous conclusion. That's good. I don't have to bash another news source for milking everything they can get out of an abstract just for some clickbait. Second, I'm going to argue that this is legitimately a safety topic. No, we're not talking about big, sexy hazards like arc flash, confined spaces, or working at elevated heights, but we are talking about a legitimate work hazard. How many jobs out there require sitting at a desk all day to perform work? A lot. If you're listening, you might be one of those who face this hazard. I know I am. I do a lot of sitting for work. Sedentary time is built into my work process. Now, this article is relatively short, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Basically, the author is talking about a recently published study that looked at data from nearly 90,000 people in the United Kingdom that wore activity trackers. And they found that people who were sedentary for more than 10.6 hours of the day were at higher risk of cardiovascular issues such as atrial fibrillation, heart failure, first heart attack, and death from cardiovascular causes. The last part here that really got my attention was this, quote, even those who also got the recommended 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week were affected, end quote. Okay, now I'm mad. I do exercise. A lot. I try to get at least 30 minutes a day, which means I almost always meet the recommended minimum 150 minutes per week. I do this because I know I should, and it makes me feel better physically, mentally, and emotionally. But I've just gotten handed a doozy. All of that may mean nothing if I'm sedentary most of the day. Am I really in trouble? Am I really heading to an early grave, even in the face of all the exercise I so faithfully do? All right, let's click into the full study now. Unfortunately, this is another one that's not open access. I had to use my academic credentials. I'll include the link to both the Safety and Health magazine article and the study abstract in the episode notes. But you'll have to get creative if you want full access to the study I'm reading. The study title is Accelerometer Measured Sedentary Behavior and Risk of Future Cardiovascular Disease. And it was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. I'm not going to hold you in suspense here. This looks to me like a well-done study. In the section for funding support and author disclosures, I don't see any real conflicts of interest. There's funding from both private and public organizations, but realistically, no one is trying to sell me anything with this topic. I can't buy less sedentary behavior like I can buy, for example, maple syrup. Let's talk about the study participants. Apparently, the UK has this really cool thing. I think it's really cool, called the UK Biobank. They recruited a little over a half million participants from 2006 to 2010 to be part of a national data set. It's all voluntary and consensual, so there's no issues there. But this is a really cool way to get a bunch of folks and build up a bunch of data for use in a bunch of studies at a later date. So, from 2013 to 2015, about a quarter million UK Biobank participants were invited to participate in the study using accelerometers. So, basically, wearable fitness trackers, and slightly over 100,000 submitted data. They tracked sleep, sedentary activity, light physical activity, and MVPA, which is moderate to vigorous physical activity, otherwise known as good old fashioned exercise. After excluding some of the sample for insufficient tracker data, they ended up with just short of 90,000 participants. Now, with such a large sample size, this ended up being a healthy mix of folks, but the average age was 62 years old, plus or minus 8 years, and 56% were women. So, what are the outcomes they measured aside from the activity? They looked at outcomes of atrial fibrillation, heart failure, myocardial infarction, and cardiovascular mortality, meaning death by cardiovascular disease. Folks, I have to tell you, as I was writing all of this down, my legs were falling asleep. I had to stand up a few times. I don't know if it was mental or physical thing, but I'm getting really self-conscious about my sedentary habits now. So, to create their comparison groups, they used quartiles based on sedentary time per day. What does that mean? Basically, if you put average sedentary time per day on a horizontal line and you distribute the participants on that line, you are able to look at the distribution curve, otherwise known as a bell curve, and then split the distribution into four equal parts from the middle, which is the median sedentary time. That median sedentary time was 9.4 hours per day. Each quartile had roughly 22,000 participants. The bottom quartile of participants had less than 8.2 hours of sedentary time per day. The second quartile had 8.2 to 9.4 hours of sedentary time per day. The third quartile had 9.4 to 10.6 hours per day. And the top quartile had greater than 10.6 hours per day. In the sample characteristics chart, you can see that the demographics, such as age, sex, race, and education, are pretty evenly distributed across the quartiles. That's a good thing. Some interesting things to note just by reading the chart and not by statistical analysis: average body mass index increases with every quartile step. Obesity, diabetes, and medication for hypertension increases with every quartile step. And interestingly, alcohol intake also increases. So, I'm going to gloss over the statistical analysis portion for the relationships between variables. Not because this is unimportant, but because this is not a statistics class, and I don't want to put everybody to sleep. If you want to just take my word for it, it looks like they used appropriate statistical tests to analyze the relationships between variables and to even check to make sure those relationships were real. So, what were the major findings? Greater sedentary time was associated with a higher risk of atrial fibrillation, heart failure, myocardial infarction, and cardiovascular mortality. However, there are some finer details here to note. First, the results separate out the impact of sedentary time on atrial fibrillation and myocardial infarction from the impact on heart failure and cardiovascular mortality. It seems like the impact is larger on heart failure and cardiovascular mortality. Compared to the second quartile, these are the folks who had 8.2 to 9.6 hours of sedentary time per day. Sedentary time in the top quartile of greater than 10.6 hours per day had a 50% higher risk of heart failure and cardiovascular mortality. Furthermore, There was a substantial increased risk for those things for every hour beyond the 10.6. Like the line graph just shoots straight up in the air. And these issues seem to be less affected by meeting the minimum recommended standard of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. So, that's a lot. By comparison, if we look at atrial fibrillation and myocardial infarction, there was only a 10 to 15% increased risk in the top quartile versus the second quartile. The relationship looked pretty linear, so no shooting straight up in the air. And when the models were adjusted for that moderate to vigorous physical activity, those relationships were no longer observed. I mean, if you want to make this super simple, but the authors are going to tell me it's not quite exactly correct. Exercise is what affects atrial fibrillation and myocardial infarction, and sedentary behavior is what affects heart failure and cardiovascular mortality. That's actually oversimplifying, but not an entirely inaccurate takeaway. It's enough to say exercise more and sit less, and you'll be at lower risk for all of these things. Limitations to the study. The authors note that this data doesn't really tell them what type of sedentary behavior was observed. We don't know if the folks were sedentary at work or if they were sitting on the couch at home. Also, these accelerometers don't always accurately detect what you're doing. They can say you're sitting when you're standing up, or they can say you're standing when you're sitting down. I'm glad they said that. In fact, I can sometimes cheat my Apple Watch when it tells me to stand up by putting my arm in a certain position while I'm still sitting. Also, physical activity was only measured for 1 week. Oh shoot, I missed that. My bad, folks. So physical activity was only measured for 1 week, and they did the follow-up 8 years later. A lot can change, and the authors noted that longer monitoring would probably provide more accurate activity patterns. The authors specifically note that this is correlational, not causational, because there could be confounders. I glossed over the controls that they used for confounding factors, which were pretty good, but there are always things that can slip through the cracks. This is actually a pretty robust limitation section, and there are some other things here that would actually be a great starting point for additional research, but the last thing I'll note is the sample makeup. The authors say this sample, as large as it was, may not be entirely generalizable to the population. This is because the study started several years after the initial population was recruited, so because they're still around, they may already be a healthier population. Also, the sample was disproportionately white, and based on population data, these are folks who tend to be healthier and have better socioeconomic status. That's not an opinion, that's in the data. Now, actually, if you were to run this experiment again, there are ways you can weight the sample to control for that disproportionate sample, but I don't think they did that here. All right, gotta tell you folks, this was another good correlational study. Something to think about here from a workplace safety and wellness standpoint. 10.6 hours is not a lot of time. If I have a desk job and an 8-hour workday, let's take away an hour for lunch and bathroom breaks, I've got 3.6 hours left of sitting before I hit that number. Add an hour of commute time and a good movie or a couple episodes of my favorite bingeable show, I'm at that magic bad number already. So the question is it on the employer to protect workers from cardiovascular disease? If sedentary time is built into the work process, is the employer responsible for that hazard? Why don't you folks tell me in the comments? Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. This has been another episode of Study Finds on the Prove It To Me podcast. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.